We had to hire traffic cops and everything.
Appreciate it.
Good evening, folks. It's nice to see a large audience again. We've got a great speaker, as you probably are aware, because Dr. Murphy's been with us before. Tonight, it is such a great honor and pleasure to welcome back Dr. Mark Murphy, who was with us about a year ago. Dr. Murphy is the principal of functional consulting, lead faculty for clinical research or education at Prosomnus Sleep Technologies. He serves on the guest faculty at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Dentistry and as a regular presenter on business development, practice management, and leadership at the Pankey Institute. He has served on the boards of directors of the Pankey Institute, National Association of Dental Laboratories, the Indoloy Council, the Foundation for Dental Laboratory Technology, St. Vincent de Paul's Dental Center, and Dental Advisor. He lectures internationally on leadership, practice management, communication, case acceptance, planning, occlusion, sleep, and TMD. And as you know, if you're here before, he has a knack for presenting pertinent information in an entertaining manner. You will not be sleepy tonight. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Murphy, whose topic tonight is Oral Appliance Literature Review, the evolution from custom dental to precision medical designs. Dr. Murphy, welcome back.
David, so good to be back. Thanks so much. And Bianca, thanks for all your help getting everything started. So tonight will be less entertaining and more factual. We'll roll fast through a review of some recent literature and some studies and some new developments over the last few years. And I want to do two things in the beginning here. The first thing I want to say is I want everybody to consider anything and everything I say with a great big grain of salt. And I say that because I have a role with Prosomnus Sleep Technology. So when you hear me say good things about precision devices, and I mention Prosomnus devices, or if I mention a brand name or anything like that, please take it with a grain of salt. David and Bianca have all of the slides. So when I'm talking about these studies and the comparables, you can research any of them. Everything we'll have up there will be peer-reviewed. Most will be in independent studies from independent journals. There'll be a few from our medical director, myself, and things like that. But understand there's going to be a slant, a bias that I'm going to have. I want that to be out front and clear. But I think the literature is going to speak for itself, whether I have a bias or not. The second thing I want to say is that David made a statement just a few seconds ago about trying to get our physician friends to come to Toronto for the Science Center. The Science Center is just, as you know, such a wonderful place. When I was in university, we went there with our science club, and I fell in love with that place. And then we used to take our kids there when they were little. And I remember taking my in-laws there when their kids were little. They came with us one time, and it's an incredible facility. It's an incredible venue. It's in a great part of Toronto, metropolitan Toronto. So it's what a great place to hold this meeting at. And it'll be something where the rest of the folks, if they want to bring their families along, we'll have something for them to do as well. So it's going to be great. But he did say that thing about physicians. So tonight is very much so in line with that being about physicians. And what I mean by that is yesterday in dental sleep medicine, physicians by and large don't trust oral appliances. And they don't trust them because they didn't work as well as they wanted. They gunked up sometimes. They had a lot of side effects. A lot of patients had discontinuations of treatment. Sometimes dentists weren't doing things quite in rules and regulations and following the medical model. So there were a lot of reasons that physicians didn't trust that. Now there's a much more scientific approach with things like the Canadian Academy of Clinical Sleep Disorders discipline, with the AADSM, with the American Sleep and Breathing Society. So there's a lot more organizations, a lot more education. So I think the elevation of the dentist to be qualified to be able to do this is much more evident. The second thing is with this new generation of devices that we're going to talk about tonight, precision medical devices rather than custom medical devices for obstructive sleep apnea oral appliance therapy, they're getting very different results. We're getting significantly improved efficacy, significantly improved adherence. The effectiveness is better. They're smaller, they're more precise. So there's this evolution, if you will, from this idea of what we had to what we have today. And yesterday we made those devices out of materials that we could see and find in the dental laboratory. And the protocols we used, the processes we used, were all in line with us using parts and pieces and materials that we were all comfortable with in dentistry. And then along comes a new company that says, let's throw all that out and let's start with a blank slate. And let's try and build the best version of this that we can without the limitations of only looking in a dental laboratory for the materials and the parts and pieces. And that's why we've had this evolution of a new precision model. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the first thing, and it's good, a friend of mine, you all know John Viviano. John was at the NADSM, we both spoke, and he gave a great talk using this same model and talking about how do we enlarge the space that this compasses for CPAP. How do we do this better for hypoglossal nerve stimulation? How do we do this better for oral appliance therapy? It's a great conversation. Today, we don't have time to do that, or I'd love to mimic what John did, but it was a great presentation. But here, CPAP is great. CPAP works fantastic if somebody will wear it. And isn't that the problem, is that people won't wear it? So it's got great efficacy, poor adherence. Therefore, it's got mediocre effectiveness when you multiply those two numbers. Hypoglossal nerve stimulation, upper airway stimulation, similarly, it's got fair efficacy, 68%. By the way, that's 68% only getting the AHI down below 20. And it's got moderate adherence, 70 to 74%, depending on whether you look at their STAR trial or the ADHERE trial. Really? So you get that surgery done and you don't turn it on every night? No, they don't. They actually don't. They're averaging, by the way, their most recent investor deck talked about their average utilization is 5.7 hours a night. Significantly better than CPAP, they said. Significantly better than CPAP. And 68% efficacy. That remains unchanged, even though they're all hand-picked dice in a narrow BMI. Oh, I could go on. Dental laboratory product utilized custom devices, better adherence than upper airway stem, by the way, and fair, better adherence than upper airway stem, 80% instead of 71. Maybe not quite as good of efficacy. And we could argue that it's more like 62 or 65%. Don't beat me up on that, but this is, I'm pulling numbers from the literature. But again, effectiveness of all of these treatments is similar. But when we move to a precision oral appliance, where we are smaller, it's artificial intelligent design, robotic manufacturing, bilaterally symmetrical titration. We replicate the original bite position within a tenth or within a half a millimeter. We have higher levels of adherence, we have higher levels of efficacy, and therefore we have improved efficacy. So you're going to see these new precision devices during the next year or so, and I'll talk about that study, get a severe indication clearance. It'll be the first time that oral appliances are not just going to be indicated by the government agencies for mild to moderate, but also for severe. So this is our mandate for getting more effective therapy. And it's going to take a different business model. Instead of parts and pieces from orthodontics and cold cure acrylics, soft liner materials like we use on denture bases, it's going to take a medical device, a precision medical device manufacturing platform. And so that's what we're seeing evolve. Today, there's scant numbers of those being done and scant designs that are looking like that. When you look at the 150 or 160 so different types of devices that we have out there. But in 2 or 3 years, I think we'll have a half a dozen to a dozen manufacturers making precision devices using better techniques. It's the evolution. But today, this is the only smartphone. Today, this is the only electric car, however you want to think about it. Today, this is the only MP4 player, MP3 player to listen to music. So everything else is so much more of an antiquated design. It's also going to require that we use better materials. The new devices that we see in precision medical device manufacturing were made first. The first evolution of them was made out of milled pucks, polymethyl methacrylate, which leached less monomer. They were stronger. We can make them smaller, et cetera, et cetera. Great. But the next step in that was moving from a dental material, because PMMA is still going to fall into the dental category, to a medical grade material. So this classification, the series of devices that we make are in a category of medical material utilization, medical grade 6, which is the highest medical grade you can. Tested for every which thing you can. Great stories about people that were allergic to all kinds of other materials, don't have an allergic reaction to this, no toxic reactions, nothing in the MAUDE database, et cetera, things like that. We'll cover those off as well. And a lot of people say to me, so Mark, precision, you keep using that word precision. What do you mean by precision? So I tried to put together a slide at the last minute that kind of told the story about these highly personalized, highly customized. They are, all of our devices are, all the devices that are out there are. But what makes them different about precision is this accuracy of the bite transfer. This idea that we can correct for angulation defects and get the advancement to be bilaterally symmetric. stabilizing the mandible in its treatment position, those 90-degree posts, instead of needing to use elastics because a 70-degree post or a Herbst, we have those too, allows the mandible to retrude when the mouth drops open while they're sleeping. We don't use elastics because people like elastics and we worry about them aspirating. No, we use elastics to keep the jaw in the treatment position so the mouth doesn't sag open as far, even though they still sag some with the elastics. But a 90-degree post prevents that. Smaller devices, more tongue space. This natural anatomical, the artificial intelligent design of the software replicates the patient's own anatomy, which we think is more natural. John Remmers talks about maybe that helps with arousal threshold and some of these other things. It's hypothesis. It's not a fact. And then, of course, using these medical grade materials. And this results in better outcomes, bottom line, versus our historical custom type devices, which have may give you the perfect bite position, may not. It's not as predictable. There's a variation there, and there's been studies shown on that. Sometimes they'll give you symmetrical advancement, sometimes it will not, because if the angle of the right side and the left side of the maxilla are different, or mandible, that can protrude in an irregular path. Stabilizing, as we talked about, bulkier, less tongue space, having a smooth surface, which sounds good, but that's not what the tongue is used to feeling. The tongue is used to feeling the normal anatomy of your teeth. And then certainly using convenient historical dental materials is what we did. So those are the design parts that happen in a custom device that isn't precision. So let's take a look at some of the research and see what's happening when we come up with this precision medical device design, what happens in the literature to the efficacy, the adherence, and some of the other things. So we'll talk about two large categories and one minor category. We're going to talk about efficacy and adherence, and then a smattering of different kinds of publications on the topics, including some abstracts that have been accepted for posters that you'll see at this year's meetings, World Sleep, European Respiratory Society, AASM, ADSM. You'll see them at many of these different meetings this year. And all of the studies that we're going to reference will have all been peer-reviewed prior to publications. They're all appeared in peer-reviewed publications. And the vast majority of them were done by independent entities. And you'll see some where you'll see sponsored by Prosomnus, then you know it wasn't an independent entity, but it was still peer-reviewed before publication. If we look at just the Prosomnus studies, where Prosomnus devices, precision devices have been utilized, most of them were efficacy studies. There were some preference, some compliance, and some side effect studies, and they've been done over the last several years. 17 different studies, all peer-reviewed, most independent, and almost 1,800, actually with the publications we'll have coming out this year, we'll get to about 2,000 or so, a little more than 2,000 unique patient data points, looking at all of the different aspects of what an oral appliance treatment regimen can do. On top of that, there were a variety of different technical studies, case reports, key findings where he made some measurements of devices and made some comparisons. It would have been a bench study, those kinds of things. Still got peer reviewed and published into something like an abstract for one of the societies or something. But really good types of testing that was done that doesn't end up published in a paper, whether it's tremendous numbers of third-party engineering testing from the FDA and from medical grade materials. Even we do a military drop test, which is a packaging test to make sure that soldiers can carry this around and it's not easily breakable. And then even interesting things like retrospective analysis of the United States has an FDA mod database that looks at adverse events. And that you find some very interesting data in there when you compare, and we'll do that in a couple of the upcoming posters that we'll talk about very briefly. So a variety of different things in the mix mash or that mishash of everything else. So let's talk about efficacy. Probably the big benchmark study that came out last year, which was done a few years back using the precision devices, was published in 22 by Mosca and Remmers and others et al. But it was done before Mosca and Remmers worked at or for Prosomnus. So it was independent, it was peer-reviewed, and it was published in a medical journal. And what it showed is that with mild and moderate cases, which is the indication for oral appliance therapy, these precision devices had 94% efficacy. And they achieved their treatment goals, reduced their snoring. If we lump in the severes, we drop down to 81%. And that's getting these people below 10. I mentioned that the target that the FDA had set for severe indication clearance for hypoglossal nerve stimulation for Inspire was getting them below 20 and a 50% reduction. This is a higher standard, getting them a 50% reduction and below 10. I did a study. I do work for ProSomnus, but it was still published by the AADSM, looking at 92% of my mild and moderate patient population. So on line with what John and Aaron were able to do using the Matrix Plus in terms of finding the bite position. Here I was using a George gauge for these patients. Eddie Saul, an ENT, published at World Sleep, 90.7% of his mild and moderate. So you start to see a pattern here starting to happen rather quickly. This is a military study, independent, peer-reviewed, published in the Military Medicine Journal, where Susan Knowles got 85.5% were successfully treated with oral appliance therapy. And again, we're coming back to that metric of getting them below 10. By the way, in this study, they were getting 72.9% of them below 5. The military is ProSomnus's largest customer, so they use a lot of precision oral appliances. This mix of patients in this population was 50% mild, 31% moderate, and 19% severe, 288 in the study. So it's a pretty robust study. Remmers, again, in 2017, again, before he was doing anything with us, a different one of the NOTICE trials, going back into the data and taking a look at that. Nick Varania's worked on that, as well as Suresh Shakandi, and they had 90% success. So we're at 87, we're at 92, we're at 94, we're at 90. We're seeing this 9 out of 10 patients you can start to comfortably think of that are going to be successfully treated with oral appliance therapy if you use a precision type device. There's just using those advantages give us a better success rate. Another military study, this was fun because I trained a couple of these dentists when they were in the military, when I would do the training for the US Army. We actually have trained some Canadian Armed Forces members as well, dentists. But again, this was another independent peer-reviewed study, 87.5% with a 79% overall improvement in AHI. Now we could stay up all night talking about is AHI maybe the right metric. That'd be another great conversation for us to have. Maybe we'll do that in November, talk about hypoxic burden and other things like that. But today we're still chasing AHI improvement and quality of life improvement. So Kang's study was another good one. Kent Smith, I did participate in this study. We did help support this, again, published at World Sleep. And we got this one out just as Evo had come out originally with that new material with a tiny bit of flexibility, the first medical grade material. And we knew it was shaped similar to the IA and similar to the IA Select. So we knew we had to expect the same results, but we didn't really have an efficacy study because when we went the 510K, which allows us to market and sell that device, we weren't required to prove that this new material is going to perform any differently than the other material. Well, it turns out it performed just as well. This one had a slightly higher, an aberration, if you will, 98% success below 10 for the milds and moderates, and the mild group was 100% successful. Jokingly, even though it was peer reviewed, I think one of the members in that team might have cherry picked. It wasn't me, by the way. These were supposed to be all successive cases in each study. And so we teased, somebody probably had a cherry pick to get to 100% for the milds. That's very unusual, lucky, if you will. I've had periods of time where I've had 25 cases in a row that in that population, the milds all were successfully treated, but getting to 55 already gets it, pretty remarkable. And this was done at different centers with different clinicians doing different, perhaps, techniques on how they took the bite and other things like that. John Carollo uses acoustic pharyngometry and has a little bit more vertical in his bite than I do. Kent Smith takes his bite more like I would, a DD Desai, a little differently over in London. So different bite techniques, different. So we know that it's not just, somebody used the matrix or somebody used this particular bite registration technique or something like that. It's actually probably the only variable that isn't changed is the device. Rahaki in 2020 did 306 consecutive patients, a little bit dip, 85% of her patients getting below 15 in this case, and that included mild, moderate, and severe in a variety of BMIs, good numbers. And she started them at 30% protrusion. Rose is a very conservative initiator of the bite registration, wants everybody to start comfortably. So she starts at a blanket 30% and goes forward from there. You'll see her again on another paper where we took a look at some of the side effects and in the MAUD database. If we start to roll the independent peer-reviewed studies up together, and we put them up against the other independent peer-reviewed studies that are out there on other oral appliances. Now, there are 10 times as many studies out there, But to get independent peer reviewed and get them both lumped together and compare them, we end up with 4 really good independent peer reviewed efficacy studies for Prosomnus, and we get an average of about 94% efficacy. And when we look at the other dental lab products, the custom devices that we've used historically, there's a significant difference of about 26% and a higher variability within the group. And you can just look at how the numbers are all over the map on the custom devices. So even if we throw out the outliers, if we throw out the 30%, maybe throw out the 56%, just take the rest, there's still about a 17 or 18 point difference in efficacy using precision oral appliances. Now, you're just not going to replicate that from different centers and different independent studies with different bite techniques and blame it on anything else other than this evolution that we've seen in materials and technology and how we make the devices so much smaller. I honestly think that's the single biggest attribute, is this precision positioning, this smaller size, so we don't have to advance the mandible, which also, by the way, eliminates a lot of the side effects and the risk of side effects. It makes it easier for the patient to be able to wear and be compliant. Speaking of compliance, thank you. Let's move over to talk a little bit about adherence and talk about some of the research on adherence. Now, this is interesting because where I had a nice list of studies that we could talk about and a large N that we could talk about in terms of efficacy studies that have been done, there have only been a handful of compliance or adherence studies that were done with objective metrics. Objective, using a Theramon or a Brabant sensor chip or something. All of the other studies were self-reported. And so when you walk into a physician's office to talk to them about these efficacy studies, you talk to them about adherence, they'll say, well, my patients wear their CPAPs much more. And then we say back to them, but the literature says it's around 50%, and it's 4.5 hours a night, 5 nights out of 7. That's the definition of compliance. And our definition of adherence or compliance over here is 7 hours a night, 7 nights a week. So if I say that it's 80 or 90 or 100% adherence, we're talking about a much more robust measurement than they have for CPAPs. Well, Stern did 28 cases, all with, he used a Bedit sensor in the bed. He used a Brabant chip in the oral appliance, and it might have been Theramon. I can't recall. I'd have to look at the pictures actually to see it. And he did a study following the compliance and adherence so that he could calculate, and what he was trying to do is compare it to their CPAP adherence. And he wanted to calculate a new metric, not just effectiveness. He wanted to look at the sleep apnea specific loss of treatment because a patient on CPAP didn't necessarily wear it all their night, or a person in an oral appliance didn't necessarily all night. So he had a new metric called the SARA index, sleep adjusted residual AHI. So that if you wore your CPAP the first half of the night, but not the second half of the night, your sleep adjusted AHI isn't 0 because you wore the CPAP for 4.5 hours, but you slept for 8. And if the first half of the night your AHI was 20 and you got it down to 0 because you wore the CPAP, and the second third of the night, let's say, your AHI was 60 because you slept supine without the mask on, and you still had that part of the night, you're still going to have a net AHI of 20, where your sleep adjusted residual AHI, 60 divided over the total night, is if you still were 20. That's an untreated patient. And yet in their literature, they would say that patient is effectively treated 4.5 hours a night, 5 nights out of 7. That's less than 50% of an average person's sleep time. 93% compliance. Incredible results. Jerry Hu did a small study with 8. He's got the, so it must have been the Theramons for Jordan Stern. He's an ENT, by the way, not a dentist. Jerry Hu did one with the Dentatrax, did 8 cases and got 88% compliance using 7.4 hours per night mean use. That's pretty good. Brenna Goodwin, who another dentist I trained in the Army, which is kind of cool. 88% mean nightly adherence, and that was a 28-month follow-up metric and a large sample size. Now the sample size is not 8,740 because 8,128 of those were on CPAP. So the oral appliance N was 360. So that's pretty amazing. There's an ongoing study. It's going to be winding down very soon. Olivier van der Veeken and Mark Bram over at the University of Antwerp in Antwerp, oddly enough, how that is in Belgium, are doing a interesting trial. It's a first line OSA treatment, FlowSat. Originally, they were going to start half the patients on CPAP and half the patients on oral appliance and cross them over after a washout period. But because of COVID and the supply chain issues, they couldn't get enough of the CPAPs to do that. So they started everybody on oral appliance therapy, it's compromised, washed them all out for 2 weeks, and then crossed them over to CPAP. And the questions they asked were, and they put chips in all of them so that both the CPAP and the oral appliance would have objective compliance data. So what was the compliance? What was the efficacy? How well were the patients treated? What was the overall effectiveness? And then finally, when they were done, to the patient, which would you prefer? No surprise, just about all of them chose oral appliance therapy. But the precision oral appliance arm of the adherence was 95% adherence over the period of treatment, which is remarkable. The other interesting thing is we're seeing this is all moderate and severes, really kind of asking a we'll talk about the other study, the SOS study, looking at a severe indication, but sort of a pre-study on that to ask and answer the question, is it a first-line treatment for severe or for moderate? And they're getting remarkably high, higher than hypoglossal nerve stimulation efficacy numbers, and getting the patients down below 15, down below 10, not the 20 that hypoglossal nerve had to do. So it's going to be a very interesting study when it's published. You're going to see a preview of it at the AEDSM this year in Philadelphia. And then I think Olivier will probably do the full paper and presentation sometime mid to late Q3. Looking at, if we take those two study sets and we look at efficacy and then we look at adherence, we could say clearly there seem to be some advantages with the new materials in terms of design, size, precision placement, precision stability and maintenance of the mandible in that position, fewer side effects, all that kind of stuff. We probably can't say that the compliance and adherence is significantly better than other custom oral appliances that are non-precision, because there just isn't any objective data. And the subjective data on that looks pretty good in the 80 to 85% range. So it begs a study to be done tracking compliance and adherence in custom oral appliances. So there's a lot of studies we want to do. We run out of time, we run out of money, we run out of energy, but it'd be fun to do a series of patients and have them wear a custom oral appliance, have them wear a precision oral appliance, have tracking sensors in it, and see if there's a difference in the population in terms of compliance. I think it's a fair question to ask. I think I would believe the answer to be yes. We're going to see marginally better. We're not going to see the kind of difference we see between CPAP and oral appliances. We're not going to see 50% and 90%, but we might see 80 and 90. And remember, every time we talk about these little changes in efficacy and these little changes in adherence, we're talking about changes in the numbers of lives we can save. Because I try to tell people that we're going to use a kind of oral appliance for you that works 9 out of 10 times, which is better than if I use one that works 7 out of 10 times. And that means that 2 more people out of 10 are going to successfully be able to wear oral appliance. And a lot of the people you and I see are people that couldn't adapt to, wouldn't wear CPAP, and might not be good candidates or might not be interested in surgical intervention with hypoglossal nerve stimulation or MMA. So we're kind of the last ditch. And we're really asking this question with this FlowSat study: should we be the first attempt rather than the last attempt? There are a few European countries that do that. A few more topics and considerations, and then we'll have some time for questions and everything else like that. Erin Elliott led a team that was published in Sleep in 2021, looking at preferences. And we were looking at preferences of this new Evo material over other materials. And the Evo material has this little bit of resiliency to this, little bit of give. It's not a lot, but it's enough that you can get up over the undercuts a little bit. And it's not as mission critical in terms of this perfect impression as we used to have with the meld PMMA. There's just that little bit of forgiveness, a little bit of flexibility to it, a little resiliency. And in this study, there were 31, there were 35 originally, 4 washed out, but there were 31 patients, and they had all previously, 22 of them had worn a CPAP, and all of them were either wearing a soft whiner device or a printed nylon device. And you know, you can imagine what all those different types would be. And the percentages of people that preferred the Evo over those other devices. Now, did they prefer it because it was more comfortable? Maybe. Did they prefer it because it was smaller? Maybe. Did they prefer it because they felt like they slept better with it? Maybe. But for any multitude of reasons, there was a preference study, and this was done as an IRB. So it was done in a very peer-reviewed fashion. Jerry Hu, he's done a lot of neat little clinical bench trial studies for us. We sent the same case, he sent the same case to multiple dental manufacturers of oral appliances, as well as to ProSomnus. ProSomnus did not know the cases were coming either. They just came in. And he sent the same case in 3 times under different names to the same manufacturer. And then he got the cases back, and then he compared, were they able to replicate the original bite position that he had taken precisely. And the only manufacturer that could do that under a millimeter, which is the guidelines for most oral appliances, are supposed to be adjustable within a millimeter, stabilize the mandible within a millimeter, reproduce the bite within a millimeter, were these precision devices from ProSomnus. Interestingly, the second one there is the printed nylon device, and you can just fill that one in. And so that's a one up for Canada there. That was about 1 1/4 device, 1 1/4 millimeters rather, for that device. So they were the second best at replicating the bite position. The rest were all over the map because they're made by hand. And those first 2 are the only 2 that are really made with really a sort of a digital process and a CAD/CAM process through and through. There's a device out there that is milled, pink device that's milled. It's got an interesting little wire across it. But then they take away all the technology they use by leaving it hollow on the inside and putting in a soft liner that they fit pretty much by hand. So that whole technique throws everything off just a little bit. Nicholas Fariñas up in Calgary did a great study with Gene Sanducci at the University of Pacific. It was published in JDSM in 2018, showing no changes in tooth position over a 2-year period. 18 were in the sample size. They're rounding up as many of those 18 patients as they can to do a 4-year follow-up and a 2-year follow-up on Evo. The scans we've done comparing them show us that we'll have excellent success. Not on these, we don't know yet if the 2-year study bears itself out as 4 years. We suspect it will. I'm actually wearing the last 2 versions of the Evo that I wear now were all made off the impressions that I had made of my mouth in 2013, when ProSomnus was first looking at playing around and making devices that were all the different prototypes. And believe it or not, they've all been made off the same polyvinyl siloxane impressions and bite registration for what's that now, going on 10 years. It was late 2013. They got their FDA clearance in August of 2014. So it's really interesting to say that I've had no tooth movement. I've had one crown done, so every time I get a new device made and I go to put it in, it's super tight and hurts like hell around that crown. So I have to give it a little bit of relief there. But I guess we could scan new ones. But I've got so many devices from so many different manufacturers, it's ridiculous. Aziz, this was in India, sample size of 10. Again, no tooth movement, no changes in the bite relationships. Of course, you know, we're all a lot better about using morning aligners, morning realigners, morning occlusal guides, whatever you want to call them, whether you make them yourself, whether you get milled versions. I think the use of those has grown so much that we're seeing far fewer bite changes. And then the same study, so I'm cheating here and using the same study that I did 2 times, so I get my name in print here 2 times. We were looking at dose in the same study where we were taking a look at the efficacy. Efficacy, we've got that down, but we're also talking about the dose. And I started these patients at 50.3% of the range of motion. I based that on a snore test. I call it a poor man's matrix plus, or a poor man's pharyngometer, trying to get a little feel for how much we're opening the airway by a snore test. And then comfort. So comfort always trumped the snore test, but the snore test would allow me to take them forward a little bit more, as long as they were comfortable. Starting them at 50.3% range, the mean titration to resolution was 1.29 millimeters. Now, if you look in the literature, historically, all those other studies we're talking about, most of the guidelines from most of the manufacturers will talk about starting patients at 65, 70, 75, or 80% of their range of motion. And so again, and you would have to, if you had a bulkier device, if you had trouble stabilizing the mandible and you were going to lose 1.8 millimeters of advancement with 5 millimeters of opening because it was a 70-degree post on the dorsal, that's the math. It's just simple geometry. But if you're going to lose 1.8 millimeters, you'd have to advance that patient another 1.8 or 2 millimeters to accommodate that if they happen to sleep with their mouth open. So these were things that led to challenges with adherence, challenges with more side effects, challenges with trying to maintain the same bite, things like this. So this lower dose, better efficacy, everything is kind of these different puzzle pieces all working together to make something work a little bit better. Jerry Hu, I think this is the final time I get to reference him. I did the same thing myself, but again, having somebody else do it and get it published was better than me just doing it. Measured in many different dimensions on these devices, then dunked them in water and measured the volumetric change in Archimedes volumetric analysis. And it was a remarkable size difference. Even the printed nylon devices, which are ultra thin in some areas, very, very small and comfortable. I mean, I've worn them, I think they're comfortable. But you dunk them in water and they displace more volume than an IA, or more volume than an Evo, and certainly more volume than an Evo Select or an IA Select. So some of these devices are smaller in 1 or 2 dimensions, but not in the overall volume that they're going to take up in the mouth. And so that's remarkable what we were able to do with precision manufacturing. Again, another preference study when we came out with the Herbst that was made out of that medical grade material, the Evo Herbst, the Evo PH. All of the people in that study, and there were, I think about 35 again, had been wearing their previous Herbst versions for an average of 43 months. And on a scale of 0 to 10, they liked their previous device 6.1. And then we gave them an Evo and said, do you like this better, Evo Herbst? And these were the stats. They found it preferable, easier to close their lips because it was smaller, it felt smaller. They were confident that it wouldn't break, didn't pull off restorations or anything. So it was a resounding success. We had, with this material, we've been seeing a lot of this. Very high percentage of first-time fit. We had 100% in this study. I think we're at 98, 99% now overall. A 1% remake, something like that. It's way lower than the industry average. And everybody seemed to like the device. The only area of controversy were the elastic hook formations and the comfort bumps to protect the corner of the mouth from all the different like screws and apertures that are around there. So one of the preference questions we asked that everybody also agreed they'd like it to be made without a fixed mechanical hinge. In the States, we have this silly Medicare guideline that makes us use these kinds of metal containing devices with either a hook in the front or a rod on the side. There's a new code coming out, so we're gonna have a new freedom to be able to do that. Now, I always want to say down south here on the border, but I live in Detroit, so if we go to Windsor, we actually go south to go to Canada. So you got to look at a map to see that one. If you're from out west, it's very interesting. This is another good example of just a little micro view of a measurement. These two on the left measured 10 millimeters by 10 millimeters, 10 millimeters from front to back, 10 millimeters from top to bottom. And then our acrylic version of our Herbst was 60% smaller. And then our Evo version, you can see the different sculpting of the anatomy, and you can see how it's just barely covers the lingual there a little bit in the anterior, 75% less volume in that anterior region in terms of the measurements of height and width. If it were a square, if we were going to consider that to be a square, which isn't probably a fair analysis, but I didn't dunk these or do anything like that. It was just a quick little bench study I did. And this is me measuring. This is not independent, and this is not peer reviewed. These are 4 pictures Mark Murphy took trying to tell the story of that lingual space. But if I'm a patient suffering from OSA, and you look at these 4 devices and you say, which one, if I want to bring your mandible forward, which is bring your tongue forward so that you can open your airway better in the back, I don't think you need an independent peer-reviewed study to show that you have some advantages over here on the right-hand side. We've got some pretty profound abstracts and posters. Some of them are going to be presented at the ADSM next month. Some were presented at the European Research Respiratory Society just a couple of weeks ago. World Sleep, the ADSM, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and the American Thoracic Society. One is another Remers and Mosca version of precision versus traditional oral appliances, looking at therapeutic efficacy. Sharkandy's on that as well. So it's sort of that, the 4 blue lines you saw on the top that represented precision devices, and all those red lines which represented custom devices. It's kind of a takeoff on that article that's going to be published in at the ADSM and other in the ASM. So it'll be a medical journal as well as a dental journal. And then the second one is looking at precision oral appliances for the treatment of severe OSA. Another precursor, like if FlowSat is a little piece of a precursor to the SOS study, which we'll talk about. This is another one where we just went back into some of the data and said, what if we pull out all the severes? How do we do it getting severe is below 15? Because that's the barrier that we're going to be asked to achieve from the Food and Drug Administration here down in the States. And then the next one, I want to come back to this middle one. I should have put it on the bottom. Let me go all the way down to the bottom and work my way back up. Another preference study where we looked at the data on the new Evo Herbst. Evo Herbst designed the Evo pH. And that's a preference study. So when you hear the word preference study, and we did one of those when Evo was first coming out, we did one of those when Evo pH was coming out. That preference study means it's not yet FDA cleared for treatment. Can't use it for a patient for a real treatment, but we can make them for some patients and ask the patients, does this one feel better? We're not talking about the efficacy. We're not talking about the adherence. We're saying, does it feel better? Is it more comfortable? Is it easy to deliver? Now, it so happened that during this study, we got the FDA clearance. So those patients were allowed to keep those devices and use them. But technically, it was a preference study, not an efficacy study. The next two coming up are two interesting papers that I worked on these with Lynn Liptak and Rose Rahaki on one, Lynn on both of them. Lynn was the primary author. In fact, Lynn won an award from the ADSM for his research on this one. If you look at hypoglossal nerve stimulation and you look at CPAP and you look at oral appliances and you say, let's go look in the Food and Drug Administration for the United States database. You can do this up in Canada as well. What kind of complaints are filed? What kind of adverse reaction reports are filed where medical intervention was necessary? And it turns out there's tens of thousands for hypoglossal nerve stimulation. Similarly, there's thousands for CPAP. And then there are hundreds in a year for oral appliances. And the point here is when you look at the severity of the adverse reactions for oral appliances, they are things like 59% of them were hypersensitive, toxic, contact reactions to the materials that were in the devices. 59% had to do with a material reaction. 59%, we're talking about materials. The others were breakage, repair, things like that, just like you'd expect. So even for Somnus, we're in there because we've had some devices break and adverse reaction reports for sure. So, and every company is required to report those. And so any company that has zero in there is kind of an interesting suspect for maybe not doing the reporting mechanism. If you ever decide to read the MAUDE database, you'll figure that out for yourself. Continued positive airway pressure, all kinds of things from sinusitis, infections, toxic reactions to the mask, materials. And again, thousands of them, but tens of thousands of hypoglossal nerve stimulation, including 81 reports of death from cancer, from the agents that were breaking down in the foams and the Philips devices that were recalled. A lot of side effects to the surgical procedure. So the point of this paper was to say that we don't look so bad. When we look at these three possible treatments for obstructive sleep apnea, we really shouldn't be too concerned about our side effects. We're working to make them better. And this new grade of precision materials does make them better, but we look pretty good. Not a single tissue reaction to the medical grade materials. It's all to cold cured acrylic. We don't have any reactions either to the milled acrylics. The milled acrylics are really strong. Finally, the next one up, looking at within just the MAUDE database for oral appliances, what does that look like? And it turns out 59% are from reactions to tissue. Told you that. None of those are the medical grade materials. And the rest of those are all the kinds of breakages and stuff like that. And there's just scant, very few. I think there were 2 or 3 in the entire database that were from these precision devices, and the rest from all the co-cures, metallic materials, soft liners, and nylons. So it's an interesting mix when you look at that database because that tells a true story. The final paper is really interesting. I hinted at it earlier. I'll just make a little statement at it. Today, these precision oral appliances are the only device in all of medicine that has shown the ability to reduce a patient's hypoxic burden from sleep apnea below the levels that cause premature death and cardiovascular events. The long story here would be to talk about AHI is maybe not the best metric, and sleep apnea specific hypoxic burden would be better, the 5 quintiles, and you want to be in the top, the lower 3 quintiles, not in the top 2 quintiles. AHI is not a good surrogate as a predictor for death, all-cause morbidity, or for cardiovascular events and hypoxic burden is. So we're going to see a movement in medicine, a movement in what you and I do from AHI as a critical metric towards hypoxic burden. We talked about the FlowSat study. I think I covered enough of this off. Some of the premature data, we're getting 85% efficacy to below 15 in the severe population. So we're really happy in the improvements. We start to feel comfortable that when we go to do the next trial, which will be the severe OSA trial intervention, that we will be successful at getting a severe indication clearance, that EVO and EVO Select will be the first two oral appliances ever to get a severe indication clearance. This sample size is 121, and this study is just about wrapping up. So it's going to be really fun to hear the final results on all this. I talked enough about this one already. Final study to talk about is the OSA study, and this is our trial with the FDA. It's being done at Harvard, Stanford, Mount Sinai, University of Minnesota, Sleep Center of Central New York, and the University of Antwerp is now on board as well. So we've got 6 centers, 100 patients, and we're going to ask the FDA to give us a clearance, just like hypoglossal nerve stimulation has, just like CPAP has, to treat severe patients. So this is going to be really exciting. We don't expect this paper will be published till sometime in 24. It'll take the entire year to run through all this. And the goal was to get a hypoglossal nerve stimulation had to get 50% reduction and below 20. And they got to cherry pick their patients in terms of BMI, DICE, et cetera, et cetera. We don't get to do that. We've got to get below 15 instead of 20. And we have a much broader BMI range, pun intended. And we don't do DICE on these patients beforehand. So it'll be interesting. All is going to be done with either polysomnograms or type 2 tests. So pretty cool study. A couple quick slides, finish up, and then we'll do Q&A and the polling that you've all got to do for your members. With digital manufacturing, with artificial intelligence design, with robotic manufacturing, we're able to shorten the turnaround time on making these devices than shipping them overseas like they're done with so many of the manufacturers today. So the on-time and in full scalability of this kind of work is astounding. I'm also being able to see this first-time fit with EVO. We don't have the same fantastic statistics with our milled polymethyl methacrylate products because they're just unforgiving. They just don't flex around those height contours. So it's really very dependent on the patient's tooth contour of their teeth. But with EVO, we can flex around it. And there's published data showing about a 14% remake or repair rate on devices. And we're running right around plus or minus 1%. And the 98% first time fit in terms of them dropping in has just been a wonderful de-stressor for me in terms of delivering a device. I think on the 150 or 60 EVOs I've done, because I only do this a half day a week in a clinic, I think I've adjusted 4 at delivery and maybe a couple after delivery. I tell patients they should fit crazy tight. And they're going to fit crazy tight. Even the device will get used to each other. If I make them feel like slippers today, they're going to feel loose in 4 or 5 days. If they're still feeling crazy tight in 4 or 5 days, I'll adjust it then. And it's amazing how comfortable these devices are and how well they work out. We survey the heck. We've got over 9,000 responses back on, is the patient satisfied? Is the provider satisfied? Would they recommend? And so we're getting really good feedback on an independent survey. And you've got to think, I always tell everybody this, you got to think, you're more likely to send a card in if you have a problem than if you don't. So we think that, if there's 9,000, there's many more than the 9,000 cases we've done over these periods of time. And we've got to think that would probably soften those numbers, but we're pretty pleased with what those numbers are. So I guess I'd leave you with this pretty simple thought. Yesterday, we did the best we could, and it was great, and we should be very proud of it. We did a great job making very innovative devices. I made my first device over 30 years ago, teaching with Keith Thornton at the Pankey Institute. I made a tap. The tap didn't have the metal part. It had a handle sticking down and a flat part in the front. It was a grotesque device, but it worked, kind of worked for some patients. And I would treat their snoring instead of their sleep apnea because I didn't understand the medical model. We did a lot of things wrong. There's no question about it. Those were pioneering steps. You think of the first cell phone. Had a battery pack, you had to have a strap to carry around with you. Or we consider these first wireless phones. Now we hold these things up and it's hard to even think of them as a phone. You've got a computer in your pocket. So it isn't surprising that after 30 plus years, we've moved in that direction. So it's good to see some of this evolution. And I really think that when we talk about raising the level of awareness and raising the level of trust with physicians and getting to engage more with physicians, it's having this clear scientific model, scientific approach, medical approach to all that we're trying to do. So that's my mouthful of stuff. Dr. David.
Mark, well, you knocked it out of the park again, my friend.